How did a bunch of Jewish college kids and housewives bring down the Soviet Union? Got your attention? Communism, anti-Semitism, and near impossible emigration were just a few of the challenges faced by Russia's Jews in the 20th century. But their plight inspired a grassroots movement that became a global phenomenon, unifying young and old Jews around the world in support of their confined brothers and sisters. These Soviet Jews came to be known as Refuseniks, and their suffering led to the largest ever gathering of Jews in American history. Grab your sickle and hammer, dust off your fur hat, because we're about to dive into the who, what, whens, and whys of the Soviet Jewry of the last 100 years. To start, let's go back to good old 18th century Russia. Anti-Semitism was serious business in Russia in the mid to late 17 and 1800s. The Russian Tsars regularly implemented laws that restricted the rights of Jews who were required to live in the western region of Russia, known as the Pale of Settlement, which was designated by Catherine the Great in 1791 as one huge ghetto for all of Russia's Jews. Fast forward a century and not much had changed. The assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881 was falsely blamed on the Jews, which set off a wave of pogroms, which were violent, well-organized attacks on Jews carried out by murderous mobs and condoned by the authorities. The vast majority of Soviet Jews still lived in the Pale at this time, but a few thousand had relocated to Moscow, where they were permitted to work as bankers, pharmacists, doctors, and midwives. But the majority of these Jews were expelled from Moscow in 1891, and it was during this period that scholars believe an early version of the infamous propaganda hoax, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was published. The Tsarist autocracy was dismantled in 1917 as part of the Russian Revolution, which led to the formation of the Soviet Union a few years later. Like many other points in Jewish history, the ascent of the Soviet Union was an example of things getting worse for the Jews before they could get better. The rise of Zionism in the 1930s was met with distrust by Soviet leaders who were deeply threatened by the idea of Jewish nationalism in their anti-nationalist socialist republic. Increasingly, anti-Semitic sentiments were expressed through anti-Zionist language. However, after World War II, the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin supported the emerging Jewish state. He noted that many of Israel's founders had socialist dispositions, which jived well with his policies and led him to believe that Israel would be a Soviet ally. The Soviets supported the formation of the state. They were the second country to recognize Israel's independence in the famous UN Partition Plan vote in 1947, and the new Jewish state even received weapons from the USSR. But soon, Soviet support for Israel decreased for a number of reasons, including the Israeli Law of Return, which was passed in 1950. This law allowed any and every Jew to return to Israel and become a citizen. Israeli leaders started pushing for Jews around the world, especially those whose day-to-day freedoms were limited, to emigrate to the new Jewish state. The Soviet leadership wasn't really on board with this, saying that Russia's Jews were doing just fine and didn't need a Jewish promised land. As the Pravda, the state-sponsored newspaper, put it a few years earlier, the state of Israel has nothing to do with the Jews of the Soviet Union, where there is no Jewish problem, and therefore no need for Israel. A rift grew between the two, and the USSR eventually turned away from Israel and instead supported its Arab neighbors in the wars that were to follow. The Soviet leaders may have thought that the Jews were doing just fine, but the Jews had different ideas. Russian Jewry felt an immediate kinship to the most recent iteration of their ancestral homeland, and their current lack of freedom made a Jewish country extremely enticing. Shortly after the state was formed, Golda Meir, the newly appointed Israeli ambassador to Russia, visited Moscow. She attended Rosh Hashanah services at a local synagogue, which usually drew a crowd of 2,000. Although the government warned against Jews attending in support, 50,000 Jews turned up to greet her, which, of course, didn't sit well with Soviet leadership. Stalin later initiated what came to be known as the Doctors' Plot, an anti-Semitic campaign that in 1952 saw hundreds of Moscow's Jewish doctors accused of conspiring to murder Soviet leaders. Unsurprisingly, the looming trial led to an uptick in anti-Semitic activity and propaganda, with plans to mass deport Russia's Jews to Siberia. Luckily, Stalin died before the plot could be carried out, and the administration that took office after him dismissed all charges due to lack of evidence. Overseas, however, a counter-movement had started to take root in response to the Soviet anti-Jewish sentiment. This grassroots movement was initially made up of young Jews from New York, but eventually reached across the country, inspiring Jews everywhere to get involved, so much so that it was later joked that a bunch of Jewish college kids and housewives broke the Soviet Union. The movement's goal was simple. They wanted to save Soviet Jewry. In 1964, Jacob Birnbaum, a student at Yeshiva University in Manhattan, founded the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, or SSSJ, which brought thousands of young Jews together to protest outside the Soviet mission to the UN and demand freedom for Soviet Jews. SSSJ leader Rabbi Avi Weiss later said that the movement arose after Jews 20 years after the Holocaust stood up and said, "Never again." It didn't hurt that the civil rights movement had bloomed a few years earlier, and many young Jews were influenced by the late Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who had spoken out in support of Soviet Jews. Over 10,000 people attended a rally at Madison Square Garden in 1964. Birnbaum blew the shofar, the biblical call to arms that symbolizes freedom from oppression. And it was at this rally that Shlomo Carlebach, the charismatic and controversial hippie rabbi who wrote hundreds of songs that are still widely sung today, penned the tune that would become the anthem for the freeing of Soviet Jewry, Yisrael Chai, or The People of Israel Live. The song was so popular that it quickly spread around the world and was chanted by Soviet Jews in synagogues and during secret meetings. Other prominent Jewish figures also got involved, including Elie Wiesel, who published a book in 1966 where he called out Jewish inaction, writing, "What torments me most is not the Jews of silence I met in Russia, but the silence of the Jews I live among today." Wiesel spoke at many rallies over the coming years and visited Soviet Refuseniks. Similarly, Rabbi Haskell Lookstein of the Upper East Side of Manhattan got his own start in activism with repeated visits to the Soviet Union and later organized rallies on behalf of Soviet Jewry. The main issue Soviet Jews faced at this time was immense difficulty in emigrating from Russia to countries that respected their basic human rights. Even just applying to leave the country had seriously harsh consequences. If they applied, Russian Jews almost surely lost their jobs, were blacklisted, and even faced imprisonment, which meant that hundreds of thousands of Jews were stuck in Russia against their will and incapable really of doing anything to fix it. These Jews came to be known as the Refuseniks, and their plight became the focal point of the Free Soviet Jewry movement. But it was Natan Sharansky who really became the icon of the Refusenik campaign and the one person who came to personify Soviet Jewry's struggle. He identified strongly with the grassroots movements around the world and became an activist and advocate for Soviet Jewish emigration, which in 1978 resulted in his arrest by the Soviets for trumped-up charges of treason and spying for the US. Sharansky was then sentenced to 13 years in a forced labor camp in Siberia. Different Jewish groups advocated different tactics to try to free Sharansky and the rest of Soviet Jewry. The student struggle for Soviet Jewry held many demonstrations and rallies outside the Soviet consulate, while the more militant Jewish Defense League, led by the late Rabbi Meir Kahane, pushed for more violent means, and yet other, more conservative and established Jewish organizations called for quiet acts of diplomacy. But Sharansky's wife, Avital, was the most tireless campaigner for her husband's freedom. She met with activists and political leaders across the US, and by the end of the year, her activism, as well as the activism of hundreds of Jewish women inspired by her, led to the signing of a statement of conscience by 2,400 American scientists, including 13 Nobel laureates, who pledged to avoid cooperating with the Soviet Union until Sharansky was freed, which he was, 9 years into his sentence, in dramatic fashion as part of an East-West prisoner swap that was pushed for strongly by Avital, community leaders, and politicians, including US President Ronald Reagan. Sharansky immediately left Russia and moved to Israel, where he was welcomed as a hero. His release galvanized the movement to free Soviet Jewry. Sharansky, fresh out of prison, took off on a whirlwind tour of more than 30 US cities, where he spoke to dozens of Jewish communities. He hoped to organize a rally of tens of thousands of Jews in Washington, D.C. But American Jewish leaders warned him against overreaching, telling him that it would be near impossible to get that number of people to mobilize on such short notice. Why risk the embarrassment of a small turnout that would just show Russia that the Soviet Jewry movement didn't have legs? Establishment leaders were even frustrated with Sharansky's zeal. Sharansky recalls them telling him, "Who are you to teach us how to have demonstrations?" But his efforts and that of his fellow activists led to the largest gathering of Jews in American history. On December 6, 1987, 250,000 Jews came together on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. to protest on behalf of the 3 million Jews still under Soviet control and against the regime itself keeping them there. The demonstration, where hundreds of thousands of voices chanted, "Let my people go," and equality now for Soviet Jews, was held one day before a summit between President Reagan and Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. Supposedly, the rally inspired Reagan to tell Gorbachev, "Yesterday, I had 250,000 people in my backyard saying, 'Let my people go.' Until you do what they want, nothing between us will happen." It took 2 more years, but in 1989, just around the same time the Iron Curtain was collapsing, which many attribute in part to the Free Soviet Jewry movement, Gorbachev approved measures that allowed Jews to leave the country. From 1989 to 2006, more than 1.6 million Russian Jews relocated to countries like the US and Germany, but most of all, to Israel, which welcomed more than 1 million Russian immigrants during that time. No small feat for a country with only 4 million citizens in 1989. Although, not a surprising move from Israel, which has always been deeply concerned with saving Jews around the globe. In almost no time at all, these Russian olim, or immigrants, made significant contributions to the country in the fields of science, high-tech, medicine, and education. Many of these immigrants were highly educated, including tens of thousands of Russian-trained engineers who assimilated seamlessly into the labor market, providing key scientific and IT skill sets. Today, 1 in 4 professors in Israeli higher education is a native Russian speaker, and that number is even higher in science-focused fields. The story of the ill treatment, suppression, imprisonment, and eventual redemption of Soviet Jewry highlights the tremendous power of people to unite over a shared cause and create change, even when there's disagreement over the correct approach. It goes to show that Jews, who can be notorious for disagreeing with each other, and some might even say have elevated civil disagreement to a religious practice, can rouse and inspire multitudes of other Jews across the planet. The lyrics to Karlbach's anthem, Yisrael Chai, were spot on. The Jewish nation lives, and even more than that, thrives when they realize that they are, in fact, their brothers and sisters' keepers.